First of all, thank you very much to all the North Capital Forum team for the invitation. Very happy to be here. Very happy to be here with Garrett Graff to talk about some very important and scary stuff. There's lots to talk about, so I'm going to jump right into the issues. We're basically going to talk about the new Cold War and cyber warfare, starting with the new Cold War. And Garrett, who is a geopolitics expert, let me start with a very broad and general question. What is the nature and what are the key drivers of this new Cold War?
Yeah, thank you, Javier, and it's great to be here. I have been struck in listening to conversations on stage in the last couple of days here, how optimistic so much of the conversation has been about North America and the relationships here. And I am afraid that I am not going to be the optimistic panel for this morning. Madeleine Albright used to have a line that she said that she was an optimist who worries a lot. And I sort of describe myself sometimes as a very happy person who spends most of my time writing and researching about the darkest things in our history. And I think what is particularly challenging about this moment is that we are facing a level of instability in the global order that is almost unprecedented in the last 80 to 100 years of sort of what we think of as the global sort of rules-based international order. And to illustrate that in a concrete way, I want to quote the first line of the U.S. Office of Director of National Intelligence's Global Threat Assessment. This is a document that the U.S. intelligence community puts out every year that sort of frames up the world and how U.S. intelligence thinks about the various allies, adversaries, and threats, both tactical and strategic, that the U.S. faces. And the first line of that document this year said that the U.S. faces, quote, an increasingly fragile global order strained by strategic competition among global powers, more intense and unpredictable transnational challenges, and multiple regional conflicts with far-reaching implications. And I think that unfortunately summarizes a lot of what we see, which is an immense amount of instability overseas and an immense amount of instability at home in the United States. I think one of the things that I think probably hasn't gotten the level of attention in the conversations that we've had on stage here in the last 2 days is the very real possibility that the United States is the most unstable and destabilizing part of the North American relationship over the course of the next decade. And I think we'll talk about that more in a little bit. But we've got about 25 minutes here to cover the globe and these geopolitical challenges, and I think we will have plenty to talk about. There's a science term that's called erring on the least side of drama. This sort of tendency of scientists when they make predictions, when they think about the future, that they sort of most assume that things in the future are going to be the way that things were in the past. And I think at the end of our conversation this morning, the audience will agree that I have not erred on the least side of drama.
Okay. A difference, it seems to me, between this new Cold War and the old Cold War is that the old Cold War gave certain order to things. We might have been on the brink of war at various points, but there was a strange sense of stability, but you describe things precisely in a very different way right now. Will this new Cold War eventually evolve, if we manage to avoid a hot war? Will it eventually evolve in a way that we get some sort of order? Or will it be a new Cold War that invariably involves constant chaos and constant disorder?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think part of defining that is defining what this phase of geopolitical competition is and is not, which is, you'll hear people talk about this as, the new Cold War or Cold War 2.0. And I think it's more accurate to talk about it as Cold War II, in the same way that we talk about World War I versus World War II, which were different conflicts with some shared attributes. This is not Cold War 2.0. This is not the same war that we had before, just slightly different. The competition between the US and the West a little bit more broadly, and China, is really about trying to determine who sets the rules for global competition in the 21st century. Kamala Harris talks about this as, who's going to win the 21st century. And I think when you think about it in that structure, it's important to think about it sort of how it's different and how it's similar to Cold War I. One of the biggest differences, obviously, is that Cold War I, between the US and the Soviet Union, between the North American Alliance and the Soviet Union, was that was really seen as an existential conflict, ideologically, militarily, sort of the sense that both systems were out to conquer the other. That is not the landscape that we face with China today. There is very little, I think, sort of ideological belief wrapped up in this that, we want China to go away or that China will go away. And vice versa. I don't think China is trying to, seize and hold, expansionist territories, in the West in the way that, Russia was the Soviet Union was trying to dominate Europe. And at the same time, there's an enormous amount of economic entanglement with China, which we have talked about over the last 2 days, that is different and distinct from what we faced with the Soviet Union. I think also when we think about it difference-wise, the alliances are going to be very different. I think the United States and Canada have very clearly made a choice about how they view this competition with China. I think it is still a semi-open question where Mexico wants to pick in this competition. And in fact, I think that there are some good arguments for why Mexico may not want to be, a key part of this alliance against China with the United States and Canada and other Pacific Rim democracies. So, I think that being really clear about what this is and what it isn't is important in understanding sort of how to chart our path forward over the next 20 years.
You mentioned Kamala Harris. The US is about to have an election in 4 weeks. Very important election, clearly. And it would seem that the impact it will have on this new Cold War would be huge. If Trump wins, it'll be this sort of confrontation with China. If Kamala Harris would be a very different sort of confrontation with China. What is your interpretation as to the impact this election, and depending on the winner, what it will have on?
Let me back up and give a little bit of a landscape about the election overall before I come in and talk about it in the new Cold War context, which is, governing the United States is supposed to be hard. The founders set it up as a government with multiple centers of power. When you look back at the founding of the United States, the huge brainstorm, the sort of breakthrough of freedom that the founders envisioned was how to enshrine a system where dissent was seen politically as part of an ongoing argument and not as treason. And in the 1700s, that was actually a really radical breakthrough in world government and philosophy. A key cornerstone of that structure has always been for the United States majority rule with strong minority rights and protections. And what we have seen in the United States in the last couple of decades is the United States slipping away from that promise. We have seen, 7 of the 8 last presidential elections, Democrats win the popular vote. During that time, Democrats have only controlled 3 of those 5 presidencies. And that has led to a situation where in the United States, when Roe v. Wade was overturned, 5 of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court with lifetime appointments had been appointed by presidents who lost the popular vote. And that is creating, for I think very obvious reasons, an immense amount of crisis of legitimacy and representation in the US system. And that we have seen, I think, in this time span, the US undergoing a really radical political realignment, where I think one way to look at this week's sort of political events is that the vice presidential debate this week, I think, was a great indication of a post-Trump political landscape, where J.D. Vance is sort of key to the intellectual foundations of Donald Trump's MAGA movement, but sort of does it in a nicer, friendlier, more thoughtful way. But that the ideology is going to remain the same. And that what we have seen is the Republican Party, I've believed all along that Donald Trump is a symptom, not the disease, in the slippage ideologically of the Republican Party. And that what you saw, I think, J.D. Vance represent is that the future of the Republican Party in the United States is as a Christian white nationalist party that bears almost no resemblance to the Republican Party of Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush. It should be more remarkable than it is, than that the GOP had a political convention this summer where not a single living Republican president or vice president showed up. And in fact, the only one of those who has come out publicly in this election, Dick Cheney, has endorsed the Democratic nominee for president. The idea, try going back to someone in American politics in 2019 and saying the sentence, Liz Cheney campaigned with Kamala Harris in Wisconsin yesterday. Liz Cheney, not notably one of the more radical left-wing members of the Republican Party. And that what we've seen this sort of manifest is a country where politics is increasingly a lifestyle choice, that it's not just sort of something that you do in the ballot box, every 2 years. It's a lifestyle that you live. And that we've seen this, drive a level of partisan polarization that the United States is profoundly unfamiliar with. And it is affecting the United States at a family level in a way that we have never experienced before. In 2016, obviously right after the Clinton-Trump presidential campaign, the Thanksgiving dinners in the United States in November, where families were of mixed political backing, Democrats and Republicans in the same family, were 30 to 50 minutes shorter than the Thanksgiving dinners where the entire family is one party. And so what we have sort of seen this reflect is this historic realignment, particularly of white men, also of Latino men in the United States. And an election this year that is basically coming down to really 3 subjects, immigration, the economy, and abortion. And I think at a very basic level, the question of this election is going to be, are women more mad about abortion than men are about inflation and the economy? And I think driving a lot of that vote is this sort of political nostalgia for 2019, where it's not that like the Trump presidency was great, it's that there's sort of this sense, I think, for a lot of voters that like America just worked better in 2019, 2018, sort of pre-pandemic. That like you could go out to a restaurant, you could go to you could stay at a hotel. There were people who like worked at the front desk of a hotel. There were people who like worked at a restaurant. And that sort of just American life just worked better. This is also an election, obviously, where we are dealing with record rates of inflation with a voting population that has mostly not known inflation during their lives. And that has really, I think sort of one of the things that's hard for the American voter to wrap their mind around is the idea that when inflation goes down, that doesn't mean the prices go down. That like, we're never going back to what things cost in 2019. We're never going back to what things cost pre-pandemic. And so sort of all of the success of inflation dropping doesn't feel real to consumers because they are still paying the higher prices that were unfamiliar to them 2020. And so this is an election that's going to be profoundly close. It's going to be an election where where Kamala Harris is going to win the popular vote by circa 3 million votes. Could be 2, could be 5, but probably a multi-million vote popular victory. And the Electoral College is still going to be decided basically on the question of whether it rains in Detroit but not in Pittsburgh on Election Day. And that's an enormously hard moment for the United States to be in stability-wise. And I think what we really have to struggle with politically right now is this question of, over the next decade, does the United States drift closer to being not the United States that we are familiar with, but the United States as a version of Europe, where we have a free trade and travel zone across 50 states, but your rights and freedoms are largely dependent on which state you live in. That has enormous implications, obviously, for economic growth. I mean, we've talked, there are a lot of people I know here from Austin. We've talked a lot about, the economic success of Texas over the last couple of days. Austin has thrived as what you would call a blue dot in a red state. this sort of liberal community that has been able to live liberal values, progressive values in the heart of an otherwise Republican political establishment. But that idea of a blue dot in a red state evaporates the moment that your rights for healthcare or education become dependent on which state you live in. And so there's a huge business implications and economic implications for sort of this drift that the United States feels politically right now, and where exactly that ends up sending us.
There's clearly huge differences between Democrats and Republicans on many, many issues, but there seems to be a consensus on China as the rival and the likely rival for the foreseeable future. Does that mean that whoever wins doesn't matter as far as the new Cold War is concerned, or have an impact on that relationship?
So everything that I just said was not actually an answer to any of your original question, I realize. And so, yes, sort of one of the weird things about China in the US political system is, despite that level of partisan polarization, there is almost no issue that has seen more continuity from Obama to Trump to Biden to whomever comes next than China. I think the rhetoric, obviously, from Donald Trump was different, but at a policy level, I think actually what Trump did on China as president would have been almost indistinguishable from what Hillary Clinton would have done as president on China. And you see actually that reflected in a lot of what Biden has done, which is change some of the rhetoric, but keep a lot of the actions the same. And I think that that's going to be true going forward between the US and China, regardless of who wins in November, with one notable exception, which is Taiwan. And I think one of the challenges when we think about this is we talk about this always in the context of the US versus China. It's much more accurate to think about this as sort of three independent players shaping this showdown over the next decade: China, Taiwan, and the United States. Independent actors, each with important and very different roles to play in this. I think the United States, a lot of the West has woken up post Putin's invasion of Ukraine to the very real possibility that President Xi will move against Taiwan at some point in, starting late 2027 through potentially, the early 2030s. There's a pretty narrow window where China has the opportunity to unify Taiwan. Xi very clearly wants that to happen. He wants it for reasons of sort of destiny and history in the story that China tells about itself. He wants it because he wants to be seen as one of the great Chinese leaders up there with Mao, and sort of completing Mao's vision for a unified Taiwan is an incredibly important part of that legacy. And they also want it for questions of security, which is China needs the ability to push beyond the first island chain to secure the maritime channels that it needs to secure its trade routes. We sort of see Taiwan as this one island in this chain of islands. China sees it as the only island that really matters, and it matters to some degree because of geography, which is the Taiwan Strait is incredibly shallow. It's about 300 feet deep on average. On the other side of Taiwan, the continental shelf drops off to 13,000 feet. There's no way for China to get submarines into the Pacific without the US knowing, unless it controls Taiwan. It's an incredibly important part of China's view of the next phase of its security needs. Now, part of this challenge, though, is also China tells itself the wrong story about Taiwan's history, which is that China views Taiwan as this unfinished piece of unification history. The reality is that no government has ever controlled both Taiwan and the Chinese mainland at the same time in history. The most that the Qing dynasty ever controlled was about a third of Taiwan. And there's this great historical anecdote that sort of illustrates this, which is that in 1867, a US merchant marine ship wrecked on the island of Taiwan, and the native tribes of Taiwan massacred the American crew of that ship. The US filed a formal protest with China, with the Qing dynasty, and the government said, whoa, 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 Taiwan, we don't control that. You can do whatever you want on Taiwan. And so the US actually invaded Taiwan in 1867. This is a piece of history almost no one knows. It did not go well for the United States. Our naval expedition was almost entirely wiped out. We withdrew, went back a month later with a Chinese-led expedition with American sort of advisors, and were at least able to fight the native tribes to the point where they made an agreement not to kill white shipwreck victims anymore. That deal, though, did not pertain to Japanese shipwreck victims, and so in 1871, native tribes massacred a Japanese shipwreck, and Japan invaded Taiwan to try to fight the native tribes there. So this is sort of this misunderstanding of history that Xi is going to try to push. We could talk about this for a lot longer, and I know we're actually accidentally already almost out of time here. But the sort of whole ballgame for the US and China in the next 10 years is going to be this question of Taiwan. Because if China moves to invade Taiwan, both scenarios are a disaster for the United States. If the US does not defend Taiwan, you're going to see an instant political realignment around the world towards accommodating China. You know, countries in Asia, countries in Europe, countries in Latin America are going to make a very real and obvious and smart calculation that their future lies with accommodating China rather than allying with the United States.
And that's more on the Trump, right?
And that's more in the Trump mind. And if the US defends Taiwan, it is going to be obviously a war that would include other countries, but it's going to be unlike something that we have ever experienced in modern times in the United States. The estimates are for the first 6 weeks of a conflict with China over Taiwan, US casualties, US dead, could be 50,000 to 100,000 soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, Coast Guard. That's the entire death toll of the Vietnam War in 6 weeks. And that will also be a disaster for the United States and for the West. That war could very easily go nuclear. That war will involve cyber, it will involve space. And the challenge, I think, that we have with these two presidential candidates this year is Trump has made pretty clear he's not interested in defending Taiwan. He wants to be tough on China, not interested in putting US lives at stake over Taiwan. Kamala Harris, I think, is interested, in following the Biden policy of defending Taiwan if it's attacked. But the challenge is, it's not clear, I think, US officials would ever actually make that decision in the breach. So the challenge for the United States, the challenge for the West in this next 10 years is deterring a Chinese move on Taiwan is the whole ballgame of this Cold War for the next decade.
Let's come back to North America. What is the role? It's clear what the US role is, and it's clear what the difference would be on the Kamala Harris and not Trump. But what is the role of Canada and Mexico in all of this? Not necessarily pertaining to Taiwan, but in general in this new Cold War. What role are we expected to play? But what role does the US expect us to play?
Yeah.
And then what is your sense of what Mexico and Canada might do independently of that?
And it's an important question in part because the two countries are very different in this sense, right? Like Canada is part of the most important intelligence alliance that the United States has, the Five Eyes intelligence alliance of the five English-speaking sort of nations, Canada, US, UK, Australia, and New Zealand. This is the key alliance for the United States against China. Mexico is in a very different position, and it, I think, has some very tough choices ahead of it. And it's, there's a question of whether it sort of remains unaligned, whether it wants to take a more public stance against China, wants to align itself more openly with China, which is, I think, a decision that a lot of countries around the world are going to struggle with. I mean, one of the differences between Russia's invasion of Ukraine and US v China is it was really easy for a lot of companies and a lot of countries to side against Russia because there was not a lot of economic value at stake there. You saw even today, Germany is going against Europe on Chinese EVs because it sees, the potential of Chinese EVs as sort of outweighing the challenges, outweighing the competition against China politically and geopolitically.
Okay. Well, I think we've run out of time, but thank you very much. Thank you, Garrett, for that talk.
Thanks, Javier.
Thank you all.